Picture yourself stepping into a silent stone hall, candlelight flickering off ancient walls, where every echo hides a tale of power, fear, and a darkness that still haunts us today. Between cathedrals and corpses, setting the stage of medieval contrasts. Imagine stepping off a muddy lane into the soaring vault of a Gothic cathedral. Sunlight streams through stained glass windows in jewel-tone patterns, illuminating incense haze as choirs chant in a language you barely understand. A few miles away, the same countryside churns with peasants bent double in the fields, their stomachs hollow from hunger, and whispers of impalements on nearby hills send shivers through the villages. This stark contrast between breathtaking beauty and unspeakable brutality is the defining backdrop of the medieval wild. In this first chapter, we'll explore the social, economic, and cultural forces that created both the grandest achievements of medieval Europe and its darkest cruelties. By understanding these extremes, we'll be better prepared to see how crisis and ambition could tip a society from chivalric ceremony to merciless tyranny. The pillars of splendor, cathedrals, courtly rituals, and charitable institutions. Gothic glory. From the mid-12th century onward, wealthy bishops and monarchs poured resources into building monumental cathedrals, Chartres, Notre Dame to Paris, and, closer to home, the Canterbury Cathedral in England. These architectural marvels served multiple purposes. Spiritual beacon, they were physical embodiments of faith, designed to lift the eyes and spirits of all who entered. Civic centerpiece, towns grew around these structures, drawing pilgrims, merchants, and craftsmen. Technological showcase, innovations like pointed arches, flying buttresses, and ribbed vaulting allowed walls to rise higher and windows to grow larger than ever before. In Reims, France, the cathedral's construction spanned nearly 200 years. Generations of stonecutters, glaziers, and carpenters worked in rotating crews, each master passing knowledge to apprentices, ensuring that the next generation could complete what the last had begun. When King Henry II of England visited Reims for his coronation in 1154, he stood beneath a canopy of ribbed vault so high that his head seemed swallowed in shadow, an awe-inspiring reminder of the Church's power and unity across Europe. Courtly culture. At the same time, European courts refined the etiquette of nobility, banquets with elaborate seating charts, minstrels strumming utés, and tournaments that tested the valor and honor of knights in shining armor. These spectacles fostered a sense of shared identity among the elite and provided a stage for political alliances. American parallel, think of modern state dinners at the White House, lavish settings where protocol and ceremony affirm national prestige. In medieval courts, such ritual also cemented loyalty to king or duke, but could swiftly devolve into deadly intrigue when family rivalries flared. Early social welfare. Beyond pageantry, medieval institutions also sowed seeds of charity. Monastic hospitals, run by monks and nuns, they cared for the sick and destitute. Foundling homes, some cities maintained shelters for abandoned infants, funded by wealthy patrons. Guild support, artisan guilds offered relief to members stricken by illness or injury, a precursor to modern trade union benefits. Although rudimentary by today's standards, these efforts reflected deeply held Christian values of mercy and compassion. They remind us that alongside splendor, medieval society contained genuine impulses of care. The grim underbelly, poverty, disease, and the threat of violence. Peasant hardship. While nobles danced beneath chandeliers, the vast majority of people toiled in the fields. Serfs, unfree tenants bound to the land, worked long days planting, harvesting, and repairing dikes. Their feudal lords claimed much of the crop, often leaving families scrambling for enough to eat. Daily routine. A typical day for a serf began before dawn. After a meager breakfast of black bread and thin gruel, men and women spent hours wielding hoes and sickles. Even minor injuries could prove deadly. A foot infection might spread unchecked in unsanitary conditions. Vulnerabilities, crop failures due to storms, crop-eating pests, or failed dikes frequently precipitated local famine. Medieval nutrition relied heavily on the three sisters, wheat, beans, and peas, but a single poor harvest could wipe out a year's reserves. In England's Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, persistent rains destroyed wheat fields. Chronicles record people boiling turnips and even bark for sustenance. One monk in Norfolk wrote that some peasants ate dogs and rare vermin, and the wretched ate human flesh. Although extreme, these accounts underscore how dire circumstances could drive communities to the brink. Plague and pestilence. Disease lurked around every corner, literally. Towns had open sores, waste piled up outside city walls, rats and fleas spread Yersinia pestis with terrifying speed. Black Death, 1347 to 1351, up to half of Europe's population perished in just a few years. Entire villages were wiped out. Aftermath, labor shortages empowered surviving workers to demand higher wages, a rare opportunity for social mobility. Yet ruling elites often responded with wage controls and harsh punishments for those who dared resist. Lawlessness and warfare. Beyond illness and hunger, medieval life was shadowed by the constant threat of violence. Border raids, in frontier regions like the Scottish lowlands or the Balkans, banditry and cross-border feuds erupted into small-scale wars. Private armies, powerful lords maintained retainers who enforced their will with little oversight. Women traveling alone risked robbery, even pilgrims on religious journeys armed themselves for protection. Common mistake, a frequent misconception, is that medieval kings enforced order uniformly. In reality, royal authority weakened the farther one traveled from the capital, meaning local barons held unchecked sway over justice. Why such sharp contrasts? Several factors help explain why the Middle Ages combined naked ambition and visionary creativity. Fragmented power structures, without strong centralized states, local lords vied for advantage, championing cathedral building one decade, and brutal crackdowns the next. Religious zeal, faith inspired both the sublime, cathedral art, mission hospitals, and the savage, crusades, inquisitions. Belief that sin threatened eternal damnation could justify extreme penalties. Technological limits, lack of modern medicine, sanitation, and communication magnified every crisis. Illness spread unchecked, rumors fanned flames of suspicion and hatred. Economic pressure, narrow agricultural margins meant any setback, war, bad harvest, pestilence, threatened mass starvation, forcing rulers and commoners alike to make harsh choices. A short contextualize, don't romanticize. When we look back at medieval Europe, it's tempting to focus on Black Death horror or knightly fantasy. But the true story is one of complex interplay between creation and destruction. To learn from the past. Avoid oversimplification, don't paint the era as all goodness or all cruelty. Contrasts were the norm. Seek multiple perspectives, chronicles by monks, royal decrees, peasant petitions, and even early guild records offer differing views on the same events. Recognize human continuities. Crisis breeds both innovation, new farming methods, legal charters, and cruelty, scapegoating, repression. We see the same patterns in modern history. Plague, famine, and faith, crisis as catalyst for cruelty. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine two villages standing in the same field. 1. A wheat farmer in 1315 stares at stalks flattened by relentless rain, fingertips trembling as he tries to salvage the season's grain. The other, in 1348, lies feverish in a dark hut, shivering under flea-infested straw, certain he'll never see next spring's green shoots. In medieval Europe, these twin catastrophes, famines and pestilences, did more than claim lives. They cracked open society's foundations, unleashing both unthinkable cruelty and surprising resilience. In this chapter, we'll see how scarcity and fear turned neighbors into scapegoats, empowered the powerless, and reshaped the very fabric of medieval life. The Great Famine, 1315 to 1317, when endless rain became mass starvation. A perfect agricultural storm. In the spring of 1315, crops across northern Europe suffered a cruel twist of fate. After a relatively mild decade, the climate turned capricious. Persistent rain, fields remained waterlogged for weeks on end, grain failed to ripen, root vegetables rotted in the ground, and hay for livestock became moldy. Cold winters and late springs, a cool summer in 1316 compounded losses, and a late frost in 1317 wiped out whatever modest yield remained. Disease outbreaks in livestock, animals weakened by poor fodder succumbed to disease, reducing the protein available to hungry families. Human toll and social upheaval. Historians estimate that between 10% and 25% of the population in the hardest-hit regions died of starvation or disease linked to malnutrition. Yet beyond the grim numbers, famine had profound social consequences. Desperate measures, contemporary chroniclers described rural communities boiling bark, eating weeds, and, even more horrifying, resorting to cannibalism in extreme cases. John of Reading, a monk, wrote that the faint of heart could not bear to witness mothers and fathers tearing at each other's flesh. Food riots and violence, in towns like Ghent and London, bread riots erupted as merchants hoarded grain or raised prices. Guards patrolled city gates, turning away starving families searching for work and food. Breakdown of charity, monastic hospitals and parish relief, though well-intentioned, were overwhelmed. Resources meant for the poor had to be rationed or redirected to more deserving cases, fueling resentment among the dispossessed. The famine of York, 1316. In York, historians note that the city's grain stores were devoured within weeks of the harvest's failure. One alderman's ledger records 8 consecutive months of emergency bread rations. Eventually, the city council authorized the burning of empty weeds into flour, an act of last resort that speaks volumes about medieval improvisation under duress. The Black Death, 1347 to 1351, when a plague rode on fleas. Origins and rapid spread. By the mid-14th century, Europe's population had rebounded from the Great Famine, only to face an even deadlier foe, Yersinia pestis, the bacterium behind bubonic plague. Carried by rat fleas, it moved along established trade routes. Port to port, Geno's ships from the Black Sea brought the disease to Messina in Sicily by October 1347. Within weeks, it reached Marseille, Barcelona, and ports in southern France. Inland transmission, merchants, pilgrims, and armies carried the infection along roads and riverways. Within 2 years, most of Europe was engulfed. Symptoms and mortality. Victims suffered high fevers, swollen lymph nodes, buboes, and agonizing pain. In crowded towns, entire families vanished within days. Mortality rates estimates range from 30% to 60% of Europe's population. In Florence, for example, 40,000 of 80,000 residents died in just 6 months. Social panic, churches overflowed with the dying, charnel pits became a grim necessity. Traditional rites, funeral masses, burial shrouds, were abandoned in the face of such speed. Faith tested, from piety to persecution. Religion shaped medieval responses to plague, and sometimes unleashed cruelty. Flagellant movement, in cities like Strasbourg and Cologne, groups of laypeople marched through streets whipping themselves while chanting penitential hymns. They believed self-punishment would expiate collective sin and halt the plague. Scapegoating Jews, in many regions, Jews were accused of poisoning wells to spread the disease. Pogroms erupted in Mainz, Strasbourg, and elsewhere, leaving thousands massacred or driven into exile. Even though Jewish communities had their own councils and records showing no unusual mortality rates, medieval fear overruled reason, and religious leaders often remained silent or complicit. The Strasbourg Massacre, 1349. In February 1349, fear gripped Strasbourg. Rumors that Jews were behind the plague led to the city council ordering the arrest of all Jewish residents. Over 600 men, women, and children were burned alive in a makeshift wooden cage on the banks of the Rhine, an atrocity justified by the promise of divine protection. It stands as a chilling reminder of how easily community cohesion fractures under the pressure of crisis. Crisis as a catalyst, power, punishment, and profit. Empowering the laborer. Paradoxically, widespread death opened space for social mobility. Labor shortage, with so many peasants gone, survivors found they could demand higher wages or better terms from their lords. Statute of Laboris, 1351 in England, the Crown responded by legally capping wages and restricting labor movement, an early attempt at state intervention in the economy. Yet enforcement proved spotty, and many landholders quietly paid more to retain skilled workers. Harsh repression by elites. Elites often seized on crisis to tighten their grip. Increased taxation, monarchs facing empty treasuries levied new taxes, sometimes without parliamentary consent, provoking discontent. Violent crackdowns, lords used mercenary bands to suppress any sign of peasant unrest, branding protests as mere banditry rather than legitimate grievances. Opportunistic commerce. Merchants and speculators sometimes prospered amid turmoil. Arbitrage in grain markets. Those with storage capacity bought up cheap grain in famine-stricken areas, reselling it at higher prices elsewhere. Supply chain disruption. Collapse of local production forced reliance on imported goods, good for coastal merchants but disastrous for inland serfs. Common pitfall. Seeing crisis only as a harbinger of doom. It's easy to view famine and plague as pure tragedies, and they were, but crisis also kindled innovation and challenged existing hierarchies. Medical advances. Although medieval medicine was primitive, Black Death era physicians began to observe patterns, e.g., link between rats and plague, setting the stage for later epidemiology. Cultural shifts. Art and literature reflected new existential anxieties. Dance macabre, dance of death, motifs reminded all ranks of society of mortality's equality. Strengthened community bonds. In some towns, survivors organized mutual aid fraternities, pooling resources to care for the sick and orphaned. Short crisis reveals character, both collective and individual. When catastrophe strikes, we see human nature in high relief. 2 key takeaways. Fear breeds both collapse and creativity. Communities can fracture, turning on minorities or retreating into superstition, but they can also coalesce in novel ways. Scarcity can sow seeds of change, whether through labor shortages that erode feudal serfdom or through medical observations that spur scientific inquiry. Crisis can upend entrenched systems. Vlad the Impaler, myth, manuscript and modern monster. Imagine a dark forest just beyond the castle walls, mist rising from muddy earth, and dozens of wooden stakes, sharpened to cruel points, each one bearing a human body. This chilling image has been our window into the life of Vlad III of Wallachia, better known as Vlad the Impaler or Dracula. But how much of the story is rooted in fact, and how much in the sensationalism of contemporary chroniclers and later myth-makers? In this chapter, we'll sift through Saxon and Ottoman accounts, separate propaganda from reality, compare Vlad's terror tactics to modern examples, and learn why understanding the sources matters as much as understanding the man. A prince shaped by trauma. Hostage in the Ottoman court. Born in 1431, the second son of Vlad II Dracul, young Vlad was thrust into politics and peril from the start. In 1442, when he was barely 11, his father sent him, and his brother Radu, as hostages to the Ottoman Sultan Murad II. This diplomatic gambit secured Wallachia's loyalty, but for Vlad it became a crucible of violence. Exposure to brutality. In the Turkish imperial camp, Vlad witnessed impalement used systematically against rebels. He saw men left to starve on stakes, their pain meant to terrify onlookers. Psychological impact. Chronicler Leonikos Chalkokondyles suggests that Vlad's time among the Ottomans hardened his heart like steel, imprinting the practice of impalement onto his own methods of rule later. This early trauma helps explain why Vlad adopted impalement not merely as punishment but as a psychological weapon. Return to Wallachia and the seizure of power. Released in 1448, Vlad returned to a principality riven by factional conflict. With Hungarian support, he briefly took the throne, only to be ousted again. It was his third coronation in 1456, however, that marked the start of his infamous reign. Consolidation through terror. To eliminate boyar, noble, conspirators, Vlad invited hundreds to an Easter feast, then ordered them seized and impaled. Over 2,000 nobles vanished that day. Impact on order. Though grotesque, these measures swiftly curbed noble rebellions. Contemporary accounts suggest crime rates fell to near zero. Few dared challenge a ruler capable of such savagery. Separating fact from legend. Our view of Vlad the Impaler comes through 2 main lenses, Western Saxon reports and Ottoman chronicles, each with its own agenda. Saxon chronicles. German-speaking merchants in Transylvania clashed repeatedly with Vlad over trade and tolls. Their records portray him as a bloodthirsty tyrant. Exaggeration for sympathy. By emphasizing Vlad's cruelty, Saxon writers hoped to rally support from the Hungarian crown against a destabilizing neighbor. Tales of dinners among the impaled and pregnant women skewed alive reflect an intent to demonize. Kernel of truth. Nevertheless, Saxon merchants did find camps littered with stakes outside the capital, so some form of mass impalement occurred. Ottoman sources. The Ottoman court portrayed Vlad as a renegade vassal who flouted tribute obligations. Propaganda aims. Ottoman historians magnified stories of rotting flesh and buzzing flies to justify periodic military incursions into Wallachia. Contradictions. Whereas Western sources describe Vlad dining amid impaled bodies, Ottoman reports claim tens of thousands of Turkish captives were impaled, a figure almost certainly inflated. Reconciling the accounts. Modern historians triangulate between these extremes. Archaeological clues. Excavations near Tarkovite have uncovered mass graves but no rows of stakes, suggesting impalement occurred, but perhaps not on the epic scale of legend. Economic records. Wallachian tax logs show a lull in trade during Vlad's rule, likely caused by fear of travel, but not a complete breakdown of commerce. By weighing evidence across manuscripts, archaeology, and economics, we build a more balanced portrait. Vlad was indeed ruthless, but not quite the superhuman monster later dramatized. Psychological warfare and terror tactics. Vlad leveraged fear as a weapon more sophisticated than mere brute force, creating a forest of the impaled. In 1462, Sultan Mehmed II marched on Wallachia. Rather than face a pitched battle, Vlad evacuated civilians, poisoned wells, and burned villages, classic scorched earth tactics. Then, along the Danube, he left 20,000 impaled Ottoman prisoners. Tactical effect. Mehmed's army halted, horrified. The threat of what awaited each soldier if captured again sapped morale. Long-term deterrent. Use of the forest spread throughout Eastern Europe, making many potential attackers think twice. Comparison. Modern insurgencies. Today's asymmetric conflicts sometimes mirror Vlad's psychological warfare. Guerrilla tactics. Like Vlad's scorched earth retreats, insurgents in Vietnam, 1960s, and Afghanistan, 2000s, have used hit-and-run attacks to demoralize conventional forces. Propaganda videos. Modern militant groups distribute gruesome footage to spread fear, echoing how word of Vlad's massacres circulated by travelers and traders. Limitations. Whereas modern states strive, at least publicly, to abide by laws of war, Vlad operated in a pre-international law era where terror was an accepted instrument. The 1918 Spanish flu and scapegoating. During the 1918 influenza pandemic, cities like Vancouver enacted draconian quarantines, and rumors spread that certain ethnic groups brought the disease. In some regions, Mexicans were unjustly blamed, leading to violence. Reflection. Just as medieval fear of plague turned to scapegoating of Jews, modern pandemics can ignite xenophobia. Contrast. Today's global communication and public health institutions aim to counter misinformation, though not always successfully. By comparing Vlad's use of terror to these modern misuses of fear, we see that crisis can warp human behavior across eras. Common misconception. All Vlad stories are equally true. A frequent mistake is to treat every gruesome anecdote about Vlad as historical fact. To avoid this pitfall, check the source. Always ask, who wrote this, and why? An enemy's propaganda will highlight extremes, an ally's chronicle might downplay atrocities. Seek corroboration. Look for archaeological evidence, economic records, or third-party accounts. Context matters. Recognize that brutality was more commonplace then. Vlad's actions shocked contemporaries, but execution methods like boiling or burning alive were by no means unique. Short the power and peril of legend. Vlad the Impaler teaches us two intertwined truths. Reality feeds legend, witnesses enough horror, and tales grow larger with each telling. Legend shapes memory. Bram Stoker's 1897 novel, Dracula, drew directly on Vlad's name and reputation, forever recasting him as a supernatural predator. Today, most people know Dracula, the vampire, far better than Vlad, the prince. When examining any historical figure, even one as terrifying as Vlad, understanding how stories form and evolve is crucial. Legends endure because they speak to deeper fears and fascinations in the human psyche. Holy wars and hatred, the Crusades and their collateral victims. Close your eyes and picture a vast procession winding through the countryside, banners emblazoned with red crosses, knights in polished armor, peasants with makeshift shields, men and women of all ranks marching under the call of Deus Vult. God wills it. This was medieval Europe in 1095, when Pope Urban II's rallying cry at the Council of Clermont set in motion nearly 2 centuries of religious warfare we now know as the Crusades. Ostensibly launched to reclaim Jerusalem and the Holy Land from Muslim rule, these campaigns also unleashed torrents of fanaticism and violence closer to home, against Jews, heretics, and anyone deemed an unbeliever. In this chapter, we'll explore the complex causes of the Crusades, the often overlooked collateral atrocities, and the lasting lessons of how zealotry and propaganda can warp even the noblest ideals. 1. From Clermont to Constantinople, a full Crusade overview. First Crusade, 1096 to 1099 pilgrimage or invasion. Call to arms, 1095 at Clermont, Pope Urban II spoke of freeing Christian pilgrims from hardship and sin, promising spiritual rewards and remission of sins. Yet economic and political motives, lands for younger sons, diverting restless knights, forging alliances, also fueled enthusiasm. Capture of Jerusalem, 1099. After grueling sieges at Nicaea and Ansh, Crusaders breached Jerusalem's walls on July 15, 1099. Contemporary accounts described streets running, ankle-deep, in blood as thousands of Muslim and Jewish inhabitants were slaughtered. Estimates vary, some chroniclers claim over 20,000 killed in a single day. Second through Fourth Crusades. Second Crusade, 1147 to 1149, sparked by the fall of the county of Edessa in 1144, it ended disastrously with failed sieges and ill-advised alliances with Byzantine Emperor Manuel I. Third Crusade, 1189 to 1192, led by Richard the Lionheart, Philip II of France, and Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. Richard's deft command reclaimed coastal cities, but he failed to retake Jerusalem. Fourth Crusade, 1202 to 1204, diverted by Venetian interests, Crusaders instead sacked the Christian city of Constantinople, deepening the schism between Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches. Across these campaigns, the initial spiritual fervor gave way to political jockeying, opportunism, and, ultimately, a failure to hold onto the very territories Crusaders claimed to liberate. 2. The Siege of Jerusalem, 1099, a case study in massacre. July 1099, Crusaders breached Jerusalem's defenses. What follows shocks even hardened warriors. Indiscriminate slaughter, knights on horseback chased fleeing civilians through narrow streets, women and children were not spared. Chronicler Raymond of Aguilas wrote of bodies so piled that the Crusaders waded ankle-deep in gore. Desecration of holy sites, the Al-Aqsa Mosque and Dome of the Rock, sacred to Muslims, were defiled. Some accounts say Crusaders prayed in mosques dripping with blood. Loot and ransom, while mass killings raged, others collected valuables from corpses, an early form of wartime spoils, blurring the line between piety and plunder. In the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where Christ was believed to have been buried, Crusaders built pyres of bodies outside the gate, lighting them alight in a gruesome offering of victory. This desecration echoed across Christendom as a triumphant but morally fraught trophy of war. 3. Crusader violence beyond the Holy Land. Rhineland massacres, 1096. Antisemitism takes flight. As the First Crusade gathered steam, rumors spread that Jewish communities in the Rhineland, Worms, Mainz, Speyer, had poisoned wells to weaken Crusaders. Zealots on the march turned their swords toward local Jews. Worms, May 1096, Crusader mobs stormed the Jewish quarter. Many Jews chose martyrdom over forced baptism, committing suicide in synagogues. Mainz, June 1096, Bishop Adalbert tried to protect Jews, lodging them in his palace. Yet Crusaders broke in, slaughtering hundreds. Speyer, July 1096, the entire Jewish community, men, women, and children, took refuge in the bishop's house, only to be killed or forced to convert. These pogroms represent some of Europe's earliest large-scale anti-Semitic massacres, carried out by those convinced they served divine will. U.S. parallel, Salem witch trials, 1692. Fear and rumor have always fed communal violence. In 1692, Salem, Massachusetts, whispers of witchcraft led to show trials and hangings, tightly mirroring how medieval crusaders conflated religious purity with violent persecution of the other. Both episodes warn us how xenophobia and mass hysteria can overtake legal norms and basic compassion. 4. Beyond religion, political and economic drivers. A common mistake is to view the Crusades purely as spiritual wars. In truth, a tangle of motives propelled them. Land hunger, younger sons of nobility, facing inheritance constraints at home, saw the Crusades as a chance to carve out their own domains in the Levant. Byzantine alliance, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos invited Western knights to help fend off Seljuk Turks, inadvertently opening the door for Western ambitions in Constantinople. Venetian interest, Venice financed the Fourth Crusade in exchange for naval transport, ultimately redirecting Crusader energy toward commercial gains, like the looting of Zara and Constantinople. Realizing these overlapping ambitions reminds us that even holy causes can be subverted by profit and politics. 5. The legacy of Holy War, fragmentation and feud. Crusader states and perpetual siege. After 1099, Crusaders established four Latin principalities, Edessa, Ansh, Tripoli, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Yet, constant pressure, Muslim rulers like Nur al-Din and Saladin relentlessly attacked, retaking Jerusalem in 1187. Cultural bridge or bastion of segregation. Crusader states fostered trade and cross-cultural exchange in ports like Acre, but also installed rigid social hierarchies, Franks versus locals, planting seeds of resentment. Widening the fault lines. The Fourth Crusade sack of Constantinople, 1204, deepened the East-West schism. Byzantium's weakened state never fully recovered, consigning Orthodox Christians to a subordinate role in European Christendom, an outcome far beyond religious aims. 6. Short when zealotry trumps humanity. The Crusades teach us that propaganda fuels violence, calls to defend Christendom easily morphed into an us versus them mentality, dehumanizing entire communities. Complexity of motives, spiritual rhetoric can cloak very secular ambitions, land, wealth, political power. Collateral suffering, non-combatants, Jews in the Rhineland, Eastern Christians in Constantinople, Muslim and Jewish civilians in Jerusalem, paid the price for others' zeal. Understanding these lessons helps us spot similar patterns in modern conflicts, where ideology or nationalism can mask economic or strategic calculations. Heretics and the Hammer, from Albigensians to the Inquisition. Picture a sleepy medieval town in southern France, sunlit lanes winding past half-timbered houses, vineyard terraces stretching toward rolling hills, and church bells tolling the hour. Yet beneath this pastoral calm brewed a fear far more potent than any invading army, the charge of heresy. In the early 13th century, the Catholic Church turned crusading zeal inward, unleashing a campaign to eradicate the Catholic heretics of Languedoc. Out of that conflict arose the machinery of the Inquisition, an institution that would outlast papal armies and mark a new chapter in Europe's use of religious authority to justify systematic cruelty. In this chapter, we'll trace the rise of the Albigensian Crusade, meet the Cathars and their beliefs, witness the infamous massacre at Béziers, explore the birth of the Inquisition's methods, and learn how righteous conviction can become a hammer-crushing dissent. 1. Who were the Cathars, and why were they dangerous? Dualism and the good versus evil worldview. Catharism, named for its adherent's Greek name, Catharoi, the pure, flourished in the 12th and 13th centuries across Languedoc, modern southern France. Its core tenets included dualistic theology, a benevolent, spiritual God created the good, invisible realm, an evil demiurge created the material world, seen as inherently corrupt. Ascetic lifestyle, perfects, the Catholic clergy, renounced meat, sex, and material wealth, adherents strove to mirror this purity. Rejection of the Catholic sacraments, Cathars believed church rituals, baptism, communion, fed into the corrupt physical realm, so they practiced a single rite, the consolamentum, as their path to salvation. Threat to church authority. To Catholic leaders, Cathar beliefs were more than theological quibbles, they challenged the church's entire social and economic order. Spiritual monopoly. By denying the efficacy of sacraments and the need for priests, Cathars undercut the clergy's authority. Economic implications. Cathar prefects refused to pay tithes, diverting wealth away from the church. Social appeal. Their message of simplicity resonated with peasants and merchants alike, broadening their base beyond isolated dissidents. In Toulouse, a thriving mercantile city, records show Cathar meetings in private homes as early as 1180. Local nobles, frustrated by the church's heady taxation, sometimes protected Cathar prefects, offering them sanctuary in return for political support. 2. Pope Innocent III's crusade against fellow Christians. The call to arms, 1208 to 1209. Pope Innocent III, zealous defender of orthodoxy, initially sought peaceful conversion, sending inquisitors like Petrus of Vos Discerni to debate Catholic leaders. When negotiations collapsed, Innocent declared a crusade. Papal bull, Vox in Rama, 1207, labeling Cathars as servants of Satan, he laid spiritual penalties for tolerance. Crusade proclamation, 1208, legions of French knights received the same spiritual indulgences offered to crusaders bound for the Holy Land, only their target was fellow European Christians. Dynamics of a domestic crusade. Launching a turreted army against neighbors blurred moral lines. Unfamiliar allies, knights from northern France, Lombardy, and even England, driven by promises of land and loot, joined the campaign. Toulouse's plight, 1211, when Simon IV de Montfort seized Carcassonne, citizens of Toulouse paid heavy ransoms rather than face the crusaders' wrath. 3. Béziers, 1209, kill them all. On July 22, 1209, crusading forces reached Béziers, a town with an interwoven Catholic and Cathar population. Seeking to separate good from evil, crusader captains posed a fateful question to papal legate Honor Amalric. How can we distinguish heretics from the faithful? Legend has it that Amalric replied, kill them all. God will know his own. Massacre unleashed, over 20,000 inhabitants, men, women, children, priests, and prefects, were slaughtered within church walls and marketplace streets. Symbolic terror, crusaders boasted of using Béziers Cathedral as a pyre for the dead, their screams drowned by hymns in Latin. Many consider Béziers the bloodiest single episode of the crusade. Real-life detail, a fragment of a local ilex judge record survives in Carcassonne, no house or priest was spared. Even those who bore the cross of Christ were buried in the same ditch as the blasphemers. From crusade to Inquisition, institutionalizing persecution. Emergence of the Papal Inquisition, 1231. By the 1220s, military campaigns had subdued most Cathar strongholds, but lingering pockets persisted in remote valleys. Pope Gregory IX formalized a new approach. Inquisitor deputies, Dominicans and Franciscans, armed with papal authority, served as traveling judges empowered to investigate, arrest, try, and punish heretics. Procedural innovations. Anonymous accusations, accusers could remain unnamed, the double-edged sword that protected genuine informants but encouraged false rumors. Use of torture, under strict guidelines, suspects could endure mild torture, like strappado, suspended by bound wrists, to extract confessions. Forced conversion versus execution, penitents often received penances, pilgrimages, fines, public lashings, while unrepentant heretics faced life imprisonment or burning at the stake. Spread across Europe. The Inquisition's framework proved adaptable. By the late 13th century, inquisitorial tribunals operated in France, targeting remnant Cathars and Waldensians. Spain, initially focused on medieval heresies, later morphing, 15th century, into the notorious Spanish Inquisition against converted Jews and Muslims. Italy and the Holy Roman Empire, rooting out witchcraft, magic, and various dissenting sects. In Toulouse, Inquisitor Bernard Guy's 1323 manual, Practica Inquisitionis, laid out step-by-step interrogation protocols, including approved torture devices and schedules for nightly sessions. His writings reveal the bureaucratization of spiritual persecution. 5. Common misconception, the Inquisition as uniformly brutal. We often imagine the Inquisition as unrelenting horror, but it varied by time and place. Legal restraints, canon law limited torture to a single session, and required papal approval for executions. Opportunity for leniency, up to 70% of accused heretics recanted under threat and accepted penance rather than die. Local variations, in some Italian city-states, inquisitors negotiated quietly with community leaders to root out only the most dangerous dissenters. Still, public interest in gruesome spectacles, auto da fes, acts of faith, ensured that executions became both tool of control and grim entertainment. 6. Short when piety becomes persecution. The story of the Albigensian Crusade and the Inquisition teaches us. Dogma can justify atrocity, even beliefs in mercy and salvation can morph into cruel enforcement when institutional power remains unchecked. Legalism versus justice, detailed procedures and tribunals can cloak violence in legitimacy, reminding us to scrutinize laws as much as their practice. Legacy of fear, Inquisition-style tactics, anonymous denunciations, forced confessions, echo through history, resurfacing in witch trials, show trials under totalitarian regimes, and modern surveillance states. By understanding how medieval zealotry weaponized religion, we better recognize when, for the greater good, becomes shorthand for oppression. Pillory, rack and wheel, the machinery of medieval justice. Picture a bustling market square in a medieval town, wooden stalls groaning under sacks of grain, children darting between livestock pens, and townsfolk gathering to trade news. At one end stands the pillory, its rough-hewn boards glinting in the sun. Nearby, a cage holds a prisoner in full view. The air hums with anticipation. By day's end, someone's crime will be displayed, and justice, however brutal, will be served before an eager crowd. In this chapter, we'll explore the instruments of medieval punishment, from the shame of the pillory to the agony of the rack and wheel, their social functions, real-life cases, and the lessons they leave for us today. The pillory and stocks, public shaming as social control. Pillory, a wooden frame with holes for the head and hands, offenders stood exposed, unable to move. Stocks, similar concept but restraining the feet, often used for minor offenses. Both devices served two purposes. Shaming, offenders endured ridicule, taunts, rotten fruit, public humiliation aimed at deterring others. Deterrence, knowing a neighbor might be pilloried for theft or slander encouraged conformity to communal norms. The larcenous miller of Ludlow. In 1323, a miller in Ludlow was caught skimming grain from the Lord's mill. His punishment, 3 days in the stocks, where villagers pelted him with turnips and jeered at his bare feet. Chronicler William of Ludlow quipped that, "No grain pilferer ever looked more foolish, his nose red as a beet from each tossed missile." The spectacle reinforced trust in the Lord's justice. Villagers felt protected knowing theft would not go unpunished. The rack, stretching confessions from the body. The rack was a rectangular wooden frame equipped with ropes and rollers. A prisoner's wrists and ankles were bound, turning the rollers stretched the body, dislocating joints and tearing flesh. Purpose, extract confessions, especially in cases of heresy, treason, or witchcraft. Legal safeguards, canon law limited torture to a single session and required official sanction, but enforcement varied. Witchcraft trials in Trier. During the great witch hunts of the late 16th century, an echo of medieval inquisitorial methods, the Trier witch trials used the rack extensively. One accused woman, Anna Muller, endured 2 hours of stretching, her shoulders popped audibly, before confessing to meeting the devil in woodland glades. Her confession secured her conviction and execution, though modern historians agree she likely admitted to anything to spare further agony. The wheel, breaking bones in full view. Also called the Catherine wheel, this device served as both torture instrument and execution platform. Torture phase, victim bound to the wheel's spokes, executioner used iron cudgels to shatter limbs. Execution phase, coup de grace, after the victim languished, a final blow delivered death. Display phase, the mangled corpse woven through the spokes and hoisted on a pole, left to rot as a warning. The fate of Eustace the rebel. In 1173, Eustace, a baron in revolt against King Henry II, was captured. He faced the wheel in Winchester's Market Square. Chroniclers noted how his bones broke like slender sticks, and by dusk, the field reeked of blood. His quartered remains were sent to the four corners of England, a grim message to would-be rebels that treason invited a fate worse than death. Hanging, drawing and quartering, England's ultimate treason punishment. Reserved for male traitors, this multi-stage execution was as elaborate as it was barbaric. Drawing, the condemned dragged, often tied to a hurdle or horse, through town to the execution site. Hanging, suspended by the neck until barely clinging to life. Disembowelment, cut open, entrails burned before the victim's eyes. Beheading, decapitation, often the only mercy. Quartering, body divided into 4 parts and displayed publicly, usually on city gates. The downfall of Sir William Wallace. Though Wallace's actual execution in 1305 predated some formalized statutes, his hanging, drawing, and quartering in London remains one of the most notorious. After his hanging, Wallace was disemboweled. Legend says he spat at the executioner, then beheaded and limb-quartered. His gruesome end reinforced royal authority over Scotland and became a rallying symbol for future rebels. Public executions as entertainment and warning. Medieval justice was never hidden behind closed doors. Executions were scheduled events. Crowd gathering, markets paused, children skipped school, dignitaries and gawkers alike gathered to watch. Merchandise and festivities, vendors sold pies, ale, and souvenirs. Execution day rivaled any fair. Moral instruction, clergy sometimes preached at the scaffold, urging repentance, while executioners read out the condemned's crimes. The spectacle served as both a communal ritual and a spectacle of sovereignty, reminding everyone who wielded power. Common pitfall, romanticizing order through brutality. It's tempting to think these punishments enforced neat order in a rough world. Yet, arbitrary justice, local lords often misused devices like the rack to settle personal scores under the guise of legal torture. False confessions, torture-induced admissions fueled witch hunts, heresy trials, and the persecution of innocents. Social divides, only the poorest faced the stocks for minor theft. Nobles often escaped such public humiliation. Acknowledging these nuances reminds us not to view medieval justice as uniformly fair or effective. Short why we must judge laws by their ends and means. The medieval machinery of justice shows us two enduring truths. Means matter as much as ends. Even genuine pursuit of safety or orthodoxy can be corrupted by cruel methods. Public spectacle risks dehumanization, turning punishment into entertainment numbs empathy and can desensitize communities. Reflecting on these points helps us question modern practices, whether capital punishment or sensationalized media trials, that may similarly blur lines between justice and cruelty. Uprising and repression, the peasant revolts of 1358 and 1381. Imagine a spring morning in 14th century Europe, fields lush with new growth, birdsong drifting on a cool breeze, and, hidden beneath that pastoral calm, a simmering unrest among the common folk. After decades of hardship, famine, plague, and endless war, the very foundations of medieval society shook as peasants and laborers rose up, demanding fair treatment and relief from crushing burdens. In this chapter, we'll walk through two of the greatest lurches toward social justice in the Middle Ages, the Jacquerie of 1358 in France and the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England. We'll see how ordinary people momentarily seized power, only to be met with savage reprisals, and how these events planted seeds for centuries of gradual change. The perfect storm, crises that erupted into revolt. A quartet of calamities. By the mid-14th century, European peasants faced a relentless barrage of misfortune. Great famine, 1315 to 1317 failed harvests and soaring prices left many hungry, or worse. Black Death, 1347 to 1351, a pandemic that killed up to half the population in some regions, leaving labor scarce and social bonds frayed. 100 Years' War, 1337 to 1453, prolonged conflict between England and France devastated countryside and diverted resources. Feudal demands, lords insisted on traditional rents, services, and new taxes, even as peasants' productive capacity collapsed. These overlapping pressures eroded the old feudal compact. Peasants, now in short supply, found their labor more valuable, yet legal constraints, like England's Statute of Labourers, 1351, tried to freeze wages and bind them to the land. Against this backdrop of desperation and injustice, two major revolts broke out, each in its own distinctive context. The Jacquerie of 1358, France's violent backlash. Who was the Jack? The term Jacquerie likely comes from Jacques Bonhomme, derisive name for the peasantry. In northern France, especially the Ile-de-France and Picardy regions, peasants fed up with war's depredations and onerous dues rose up in May 1358. Catalyst, in 1356, King John II of France was captured by the English at Poitiers. With royal authority weakened, noble armies disbanded or turned to banditry, free companies pillaged villages, demanding protection money from terrified peasants. Immediate spark, a skirmish in the village of Saint Leu resulted in a local seigneur's death, inflaming anger across the region. Meaux and its wrath. Chronicler Jean Froissart describes how, in the town of Meaux, enraged peasants halted a tax collector's cart, killed him, and burned his papers. They then stormed nearby manors, dragging burnt corpses along the roads as warning signs. Reports mention a peasant leader, Etienne Marcel, who temporarily allied with Parisian radicals, symbolizing a brief unity between urban and rural dissent. The brutal suppression. Noble retaliation was swift and merciless. Within weeks, major battles, Charles II of Navarre and royal marshals crushed peasant forces near Mello. Reprisals, lords hunted down rebels, many summarily executed, hanged, beheaded, bodies thrown into mass graves. Aftermath, villages suspected of Jacobin sympathies were razed, their fields salted in symbolic curse. Froissart's lament is heartfelt, never had this fair land seen such cruelty, brother turned on brother, neighbor slew neighbor. Though the revolt lasted only a few weeks, its echoes haunted French lords, who tightened fortress defenses against future uprisings. The English peasants' revolt of 1381, from tax burdens to London's footsteps. Setting the stage, taxes, war, and the poll tax. England, too, reeled from the Black Death's demographic collapse and costly wars with France. The crown's coffers drained, successive poll taxes were levied. First poll tax, 1377, a flat charge of 4 pence per person over age 14. Second poll tax, 1379, increased to 6 pence. Third poll tax, 1381, a staggering 12 pence, tripling burdens in just 4 years. Peasants already resenting new enclosures, lords fencing off common land, and labor restrictions saw the poll tax as the final straw. Sparked to flame, Wat Tyler and John Ball. In May 1381, rebels in Essex and Kent organized under 2 charismatic figures. Wat Tyler, a tanner from Dartford, chosen as military leader. John Ball, a fiery priest who preached when Adam dealt and Eve span, who was then the gentleman. Highlighting the rebels' belief in natural equality. Within days, thousands of rebels marched on London, cutting down tax commissioners and confronting the young King Richard II himself. Smithfield Showdown. At Smithfield, rebels met Richard II and his court. Tyler presented a list of demands: abolition of serfdom, fair rents, release of imprisoned rebels. Richard, surprisingly deferential, agreed, until Tyler, emboldened, confronted the city's mayor, William Walworth. In the ensuing scuffle, Tyler was struck down and killed. Reading Tyler's limp figure on the ground chilled the rebels' hearts, leadership dissolved, and the moment of negotiation turned to retribution. The price of rebellion, retribution and lessons. After the revolt, harsh crackdown. Once Richard reasserted control. Executions and imprisonments, estimates suggest over 1,500 rebels were executed in the weeks that followed. Nullified concessions, royal pardons and charters Richard had granted were quickly revoked. Symbolic terror, rebels' heads adorned London Bridge as grisly reminders not to challenge royal authority. Unintended consequences. Despite the revolt's failure, it left a legacy. End of the poll tax, no further national poll taxes were levied, recognizing its political poison. Gradual decline of serfdom, labor shortages continued to empower peasants. Over the next century, unfree labor waned, giving way to wage-based tenancy. Short the double-edged sword of popular revolt. From Parisian lords' vengeance in 1358 to Richard II's broken promises in 1381, these revolts teach us. Desperation breeds courage, and chaos. When basic survival or dignity is at stake, people risk everything. Elite fear ensures brutal repression. Ruling classes often respond with excessive force, aiming to quash dissent rather than address root causes. Reform sneaks in through the back door. Even failed uprisings can prompt rulers to scrap the worst abuses. No more poll taxes, fewer forced labor bindings, illustrating how bottom-up pressure shapes policy over time. By understanding both the heroism and the harsh realities of these revolts, we gain empathy for those who dare to demand change, and we recognize the costs they often pay. Empire on Skulls, Timur's dual legacy of massacre and mosaic. Close your eyes and picture 2 scenes side by side. On one hand, a bustling city square in 14th century Samarkand, tiled mosaics flashing in the sun as merchants haggle over silks. On the other, beyond the city walls, towers of human skulls, each a grim monument to a conquered foe. These contrasting images capture the paradox of Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, Timur the Lame, the Turco-Mongol warlord who, in the late 1300s and early 1400s, carved an empire across Central Asia and the Middle East with breathtaking ferocity, and then poured vast wealth into building some of the era's most spectacular monuments. In this chapter, we'll trace his rise from orphan warrior to sovereign of a domain stretching from Anatolia to India, examine both his unparalleled brutality and his cultural patronage, and distill a lesson about the complexities of power that still resonates today. 1. From steppe outcast to conqueror. Early life and hardship. Born around 1336 in what is now Uzbekistan, Timur came from the Balist tribe, descended from Mongol soldiers but regarded as second class by the heirs of Genghis Khan. A severe leg injury in childhood earned him the epithet, the lame, but also steeled his resolve. Survival on the margins. As a young man, Timur subsisted by raiding caravans and serving local chieftains. His personal hardships, physical disability, tribal scorn, bred in him a fierce ambition to prove himself on a grander stage. Forge of alliances. By his mid-20s, Timur had attracted a band of warriors loyal to his leadership, combining steppe nobility with emerging tactics drawn from Persian and Turkic military traditions. Declaring a new khanate. In 1370, Timur proclaimed himself Emir, effectively resurrecting and outstripping the fragmented Chagatai Khanate. His statecraft blended the charismatic authority of a steppe chieftain with the bureaucratic apparatus of the Islamic courts he now sought to dominate. 2. Conquest by fire and sword. Campaigns across Asia. Over the next 3 decades, Timur launched successive expeditions. Persia and Mesopotamia, 1381 to 1386. Cities like Isfahan and Baghdad fell. Timur's armies looted treasures and leveled defenses. Caucasus and Anatolia, 1394 to 1402. He famously defeated and captured Ottoman Sultan Bayezid I at the Battle of Ankara, 1402, a stunning reversal that shook the rising Ottoman Empire. India, 1398 to 1399. Sweeping through the Khyber Pass, Timur sacked Delhi. Chroniclers record 3 days of slaughter, with an estimated 100,000 captives taken for sale into slavery. Towers of Skulls, psychological warfare. Timur's signature terror tactic was the construction of skull towers. Mechanics. After a victory, his engineers collected severed heads, removing soft tissue to fit skulls atop wooden stakes in pyramidal arrangements. Impact. At Isfahan, Arab chronicler Ibn Khaldun noted that passers-by wept at the sight. In Delhi, so many heads were piled that they became visible from miles away. These grim monuments enforced submission without further bloodshed. Prospective rebels saw the towers and surrendered. 3. The builder patron, Timurid Renaissance. Samarkand's splendor. Despite, or perhaps because of, his violence, Timur invested heavily in architecture and arts. Bibi Khanum Mosque, named for his favorite wife, this grand mosque, completed circa 1405, featured soaring iwans, vaulted halls, intricate tilework, and vast courtyards capable of hosting thousands of worshippers. Göy Emir Mausoleum, Timur's own tomb, adorned with azure tiles and fluted domes, became a prototype for later Mughal architecture in India, including Humayun's tomb and the Taj Mahal. Cultural fusion. Timur brought artisans, calligraphers, and scholars from every conquered region to Samarkand. The city became a melting pot. Persian poets, courts patronized poets like Eilish and Avoy, who composed in both Persian and Chagatai Turkic. Scientific exchange. Astronomers built observatories, mathematicians refined algebraic methods. This investment in culture helped legitimize Timur's role. To rule by fear was one thing, but to cultivate learning and beauty cast him in the mold of a universal sovereign. 4. Reconciling the contradiction. How could one man be both exterminator and patron of splendor? 2 perspectives help us understand. Steppe tradition. Nomadic conquerors from Attila to Genghis Khan saw terror, and the lavish spoils that followed, as complementary tools of statecraft. Timur, in this lineage, simply amplified both together. Islamic kingship ideals. Once settled in cities, Timur embraced the model of the Persianate Shah, expected to support scholarship and architecture. Monumental buildings symbolized divine favor, a necessary counterbalance to the moral taint of conquest. Modern parallel. ISIS versus heritage restoration. In recent years, groups like ISIS destroyed ancient monuments to spread terror, while regimes such as Iraq's post-2003 government have invested in rebuilding sites like Babylon as symbols of national identity. Timur's dual legacy, wrecking cities then funding majestic cultural projects, mirrors our own era's tug-of-war between destruction and reconstruction. 5. Common misconception, demonizing Eastern despots. It's all too easy to label Timur barbaric, without noting that contemporary European rulers often matched, or exceeded, his brutality. King John of England employed torture and executed nobles. The Crusaders used scorched earth tactics and massacres. The Spanish Reconquista featured forced conversions and Inquisition methods. Acknowledging this avoids simplistic East versus West judgments and shows that absolute power, regardless of culture, carries a similar capacity for cruelty. 6. Short complexity over caricature. Timur's life reminds us. Historical figures live in context, their choices reflect the norms and pressures of their time, both the bright and the dark. Monuments are multivalent, towers of skulls and tiled mosques both serve to project power, one through terror, the other through awe. Legacy outlives intent. Timur likely never imagined his architectural patronage would inspire future empires half a world away, yet it did. By holding both sides of Timur's legacy in view, we resist glorifying his brutality or dismissing his contributions to art and science. Civil War to Constitution, from Magna Carta to Wars of the Roses. Imagine a grand tapestry woven with threads of power, rebellion, law, and blood, a picture of medieval England where kings asserted divine right authority, barons pushed back, and dynasties rose and fell in cycles of alliance and betrayal. Between the sealing of the Magna Carta in 1215 and the brutal Wars of the Roses of the 15th century, England's political landscape transformed from feudal arbitrariness toward a nascent constitutional order, even as it convulsed in civil war. In this chapter, we'll trace how King John's tyrannical reign provoked the First Charter of Rights, how that document's promises ignited baronial revolt, and how two branches of the royal family ultimately bled each other white in a dynastic struggle that closed the medieval era. 1. King John's misrule and the road to Runnymede. From Lionheart's brother to disastrous king. When Richard the Lionheart died in 1199, his younger brother John Lackland inherited the throne, a man far less beloved. Loss of French territories, through diplomatic blunders and military defeats, John surrendered Normandy and much of England's ancestral lands to the French King Philip II. This humiliation sparked outrage among the English nobility, who depended on continental fiefs for income and prestige. Heavy taxation and arbitrary fines, to fund lost territories and reward German mercenaries, John levied unprecedented scutage, payments in lieu of military service, fines for inheritance disputes, and outright extortion. Conflict with the Church. After a quarrel over the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Pope Innocent III placed England under interdict, mass closing of churches, and excommunicated John, forcing him eventually to submit as a papal vassal, another blow to royal dignity. By 1215, barons felt they'd endured enough. Chronicler Roger of Wendover wrote, "They swore never again to endure injustice, nor to serve an overlord who acted above the law." Sealing the Magna Carta, June 15, 1215. At Runnymede, on the banks of the Thames, 25 rebel barons cornered John into sealing a charter limiting royal power. Protection of church rights. The English church shall be free, and shall have its rights undiminished. Feudal due process. Nobles could not be fined arbitrarily. No free man shall be arrested, except by the lawful judgment of his peers. Access to justice. To none will we sell, to none deny or delay, right or justice. Council of 25 barons, a group empowered to enforce the charter, essentially checking the king's authority. Though drafted to address baronial grievances, Magna Carta famously declared all free men, planting seeds for broader liberties. 2. Civil War and Charter's short-lived promise. First Barons' War, 1215 to 1217. John immediately sought to annul Magna Carta. When Pope Innocent III declared it shameful and illegal, John resumed oppressive tactics, igniting conflict. Baronial rebellion. Rebels invited French Prince Louis to take the throne, an audacious bid that nearly succeeded when Louis entered London in 1216. Death of King John, 1216. Struck by dysentery, John died, unexpectedly passing the crown to his 9-year-old son Henry III. His regents reissued Magna Carta in 1216 and 1217 to placate rebels, ensuring young Henry's survival. Battle of Lincoln, 1217, a decisive royalist victory, combined with a naval defeat off Sandwich and Louis's waning support, secured Henry's throne and ended the war. Though Magna Carta's Enforcement Council dissolved, its principles endured in reissues, 1225, 1297, morphing from immediate peace treaty to constitutional touchstone. Legacy in law. Over the next century, Magna Carta. Inspiration for common law. Judges and legal scholars cited its clauses to challenge arbitrary punishment or fines. Parliamentary roots. The principle that taxation required baronial, or later, parliamentary, consent evolved into the idea of no taxation without representation. Model for later charters. English settlers in North America carried Magna Carta with them. Colonial charters and the U.S. Constitution echo its language on due process and jury trial. Magna Carta's enduring power lay less in immediate change than in planting the idea that rulers, too, must follow the law. 3. The path to the Wars of the Roses. A century of unsteady roll. The 13th and early 14th centuries saw intermittent baronial rebellions, e.g., Simon de Montfort's revolt in 1264, economic growth, and legal developments. But a weak monarchy under Henry VI, reigned 1422–61, 1470–71, sowed seeds of dynastic conflict. Mental illness. Henry's periodic incapacities allowed magnates to vie for power. Loss in Hundred Years' War. Defeats at Agincourt, 1415, shifted fortunes. English holdings in France dwindled, undermining royal prestige. Factional rivalries. The houses of Lancaster, Henry's line, and York, descended from Edward III's second son, jockeyed for control, citing claims rooted in complex genealogies. Outbreak of civil war, 1455 to 1487. By mid-1450s, tensions exploded into the Wars of the Roses, named after the Red Rose of Lancaster and White Rose of York. First Battle of St. Albans, 1455. Richard, Duke of York, captured King Henry VI, beginning open hostilities. Battle of Towton, 1461. Fought amid driving snow. This was England's bloodiest battle, some 28,000 dead. Edward IV, Yorkist, seized the throne. Readaptation and final defeat. Henry VI briefly returned, 1470–71, but was deposed again. Finally, Battle of Bosworth Field, 1485, saw Henry Tudor, Lancaster claimant, defeat and kill Richard III, ending the conflict. Tudor ascendancy. Henry Tudor crowned Henry VII, marrying Elizabeth of York, symbolically uniting the houses and inaugurating the Tudor dynasty. 4. From persecution to precedent. Consider Sir Simon Burley, a favourite of Edward III. In 1388, decades before the Wars of the Roses, he was executed by the merciless Parliament as part of a Yorkist coup against the king's inner circle. His downfall illustrated a larger point: even those closest to power could fall prey to factional justice, setting precedents later exploited in dynastic feuds. 5. Common misconception: Magna Carta as a people's charter. It's easy to imagine Magna Carta as a democratic milestone for peasants and townsfolk. Yet, limited scope. Original charter protected barons and church rights. Commoners remained largely excluded. Caste privilege. Free men did not include serfs or most urban laborious. Gradualism. Magna Carta's broader application to ordinary citizens emerged only over centuries, through repeated legal challenges and reinterpretations. Recognizing these limits helps us appreciate both its revolutionary ideals and the slow pace of real social change. 6. Short stability through balanced power. The interplay between royal authority and baronial rights in medieval England teaches us. Checks and balances matter. Even absolute power tends to overreach. Institutional constraints. Magna Carta's legacy can channel conflict into legal frameworks rather than endless violence. Dynastic security depends on consensus. Henry VII's marriage of Lancaster and York symbolized the power of political compromise to end fratricidal war. Legal principles outlast individuals. Laws grounded in principle, due process, consent to taxation, endure far beyond the reign of any king or the outcome of any single battle. The Borgia Blueprint, Cesare, Machiavelli and the Ethics of Power. Imagine a stately Renaissance palace in central Italy, frescoes gleam on the walls, courtiers whisper in sumptuous galleries, and through arched windows you glimpse rolling vineyards below. Yet beneath the veneer of elegance lies a tale of cutthroat ambition, fratricide, and political cunning so audacious it inspired one of history's most infamous treatises on statecraft. This is the world of Cesare Borgia, son of Pope Alexander VI, whose meteoric rise and fall in late 15th century Italy became both exemplar and warning for rulers, most notably Niccolò Machiavelli, who immortalized Cesare as the archetype of the new prince. In this chapter, we'll trace Cesare's transformation from cardinal to condottiero, examine his ruthless methods and spectacular victories, explore Machiavelli's admiration and critique in The Prince, and distill a lesson on the ethics of power that still resonates today. 1. From scarlet robes to battle armor, Cesare's unlikely career path. Noble blood and papal favor. Born in 1475, Cesare Borgia was the second of Rodrigo Borgia's many children. Rodrigo, master of Renaissance nepotism, became Pope Alexander VI in 1492, instantly elevating his family's fortunes. Cardinal at 18, Rodrigo appointed Cesare as cardinal deacon, an honorific position combining wealth and influence but requiring vows of celibacy Cesare never intended to keep. Fratricide and choice, his elder brother, Giovanni, enjoyed his father's favor as a military leader. Tension mounted until Giovanni's mysterious death in 1497. Most historians agree Cesare arranged the murder, eliminating a rival and freeing himself to abandon the church for secular power. Renouncing the cloth. Freed from ecclesiastical constraints, Cesare gained papal dispensation to trade his red robes for armor. By 1498 he was appointed captain general of the papal armies, entrusted with carving out territories from factious Italian city-states. 2. Machiavelli's School of Realpolitik. A new model prince. In 1513, 10 years after Cesare's death, Niccolò Machiavelli published Illinois Principe. Chapter 7 holds up Cesare as a living demonstration of virtue, not moral virtue, but the ability to shape fortune through decisiveness and bold action. Fear over love. Machiavelli argues it is safer for a prince to be feared than loved when he cannot be both. Cesare's brand of calculated cruelty kept adversaries in check. Use of mercenaries versus militia. Cesare built an army of loyal followers from his father's condottieri network, an adaptable force rather than unreliable hired bands. By praising Cesare's tactics, his willingness to break oaths, his swift elimination of dissenters, Machiavelli sparked centuries of debate on whether immoral actions can ever serve a higher good. 3. The conquest of Romagna. Strategic masterstroke. Between 1500 and 1503, Cesare systematically brought the Papal States' unruly northeastern provinces under firm control. Alliances and betrayals, he made temporary pacts with local lords, only to arrest them at a banquet, confiscate their lands, and redistribute estates to his captains. Sinister display. In Faenza, he publicly crucified Tagliacozzo's leaders on city gates, spectacle reminding every citizen of the price of resistance. Administrative reforms. To cement authority, Cesare installed a rudimentary bureaucracy, tax collectors, judges, and a courier network, laying foundations for more stable governance. In just 3 years, Cesare's forces subdued Bologna, Rimini, and Urbino. Yet when his father died in 1503, so too did Cesare's patronage, enemies rallied, and his territories collapsed almost overnight. 4. The moral calculus of statecraft. Cesare's ethical tightrope. Cesare's methods raise an enduring question: can morally dubious acts be justified if they secure stability and prosperity? Ends versus means. To achieve rapid unification, he spared neither friend nor foe. Yet some towns under his rule enjoyed reduced banditry and predictable administration, benefits rare in Renaissance Italy's patchwork of feuding principalities. Personal ambition versus public good. Critics argue Cesare served papal and personal ambitions more than the common welfare. Yet Machiavelli points out that the very appearance of stability attracted merchants, artisans, and scholars eager to work under a strong ruler. Modern parallel. Post-colonial state building. In the 20th century, newly independent states sometimes relied on authoritarian leaders who traded harsh repression for rapid modernization. Think of certain regimes in East Asia. Like Cesare, they faced similar dilemmas: sacrifice individual freedoms to prevent chaos, or risk disintegration by upholding liberal ideals too soon. 5. Common misconception: Machiavelli as cynical nihilist. It's easy to brand Machiavelli, and by extension Césaire, as champions of a moral tyranny. Yet, context of crisis, The Prince was written amid Italy's fragmentation and foreign invasions. Machiavelli sought practical advice to unify and defend his homeland. Balance of virtue and fortuna, Machiavelli acknowledges limits. Excessive cruelty can provoke hatred that undermines long-term rule. Césaire's rapid fall after his father's death illustrates this fragile balance. Republican ideals elsewhere, Machiavelli's other works, Discourses on Livy, praise republican institutions, showing he did not dismiss moral governance altogether. Understanding this nuance helps us see Césaire's life not as mere homage to cruelty, but as a case study in the constraints and possibilities of power. 6. Short ruling with caution and conviction. Césaire Borgia's story and Machiavelli's reflections teach us strategic flexibility. Successful leaders adapt. Césaire's shift from cardinal to condottiero shows the importance of seizing new roles when circumstances change. Calculated severity, at times, firmness deters greater bloodshed, but wield cruelty sparingly to avoid lasting resentment. Institutional foundations, building administrative and legal frameworks sustains authority beyond an individual's lifespan. By learning these lessons, modern decision-makers, whether in politics, business, or community leadership, can balance ethical considerations with the demands of effective governance. As Césaire's short-lived empire shattered and Machiavelli's pen ignited debates across Europe, the medieval tapestry we've unraveled now reaches its close. From the grand cathedrals and grim dungeons to tall towers and Renaissance palaces, we've journeyed through highs of artistry and lows of atrocity. In our final section, Epilogue, Reflections on Medieval Cruelty and Compassion, we'll weave together these threads into a broader understanding of what the Middle Ages teach us, and how their lessons can guide our path forward today. Keep your lantern lit for our closing thoughts, as we step back to view the whole tapestry in a single glance.